My grandfather was a very well-loved figure in my family. He always smiled and liked to spend time with us. I've always wondered what his life was like in the early 20th century, where wars happened everywhere, and what events shaped his life. A few weeks before my grandfather passed away, he shared with us his own personal diary of his life history timeline. My grandfather, named Lam Teng, was born in 1925 in a poor village in Fasan in the Guangdong province of China. He was an only child. He had short schooling for just 2 years because his dad was deeply affected by the scourge of opium. Even worse, my grandfather watched his father being beaten to death. Then my grandfather's mother remarried and left him. My grandfather, at the age of 9, became an orphan and stayed with his grandmother. However, she couldn't afford to look after him anymore in a poor village. In 1937, when my grandfather was 12, there was the Nanking Massacre, where the Japanese troops killed more than 300,000 Chinese. 2 years later, Japanese troops took over Guangdong province. His grandmother urged him to flee to Hong Kong, so he solely walked for 240 kilometers for 15 days to pass through high mountains and small hills from his village Fasan to Hong Kong in search of his distant cousin, in hope to get safety and to be looked after. At last, he got shelter from his distant cousin and did apprenticeship as a carpenter. His distant cousin, as his mentor, treated him harshly, not giving him enough food and clothes and asking him to do arduous work. In 1941, when my grandfather was 16, Japanese troops occupied Hong Kong. My grandfather needed to flee from Hong Kong back to Fasan again. It also took him 15 days, where he walked from early morning to late night. There he worked as a farmer for half a year. However, he couldn't earn his living, so he then went to Guangzhou City in Guangdong province in searching for work. In 1945, Japan surrendered. In the years later, there was Chinese Civil War between the Nationalists and the Communist parties. At that time, my grandfather was 21 years old. When he was searching for work on a main street, he was approached by a man who deceived my grandfather that he needed a kitchen hand. In fact, my grandfather was tricked into serving the Nationalist Army in their kitchen and was forced to wear their uniform. When he knew that this Nationalist Army was going to go northwards to fight against the Communist Army, he kept thinking of plans to escape. However, he knew if he was caught, he would be severely punished and even killed. Nevertheless, he still found an opportunity to escape. As he was fleeing, he met a good Samaritan who had pity on him and gave him clothes to change to disguise him as an ordinary villager. Even though my grandfather was very scared, in order to leave Guangdong province, he calmly and bravely walked through the gates that was guarded by soldiers and escaped to Hong Kong. During the Civil War, the Nationalists lost. My grandfather felt very blessed to have successfully escaped. In Hong Kong, my grandfather reluctantly went back to his cruel distant cousin and persevered with his harsh apprenticeship as a carpenter. A few years later, he proudly became a Hong Kong citizen and finished his carpentry apprenticeship and became a successful carpenter in Hong Kong. Later, he met my grandmother and got comfort since then. In 1955, they got married. Together, they had 5 children. His second child was my mother. My grandfather needed to work very hard 7 days a week to feed his big family. He wanted to give all his children everything that he couldn't have when he was an orphan boy. He wanted to give them good education, stable shelter, care and love, and a sense of security. In order to support his family, he was even willing to receive the offers to do dangerous jobs, such as mending the roofs of tall buildings. And there were no safety harnesses during those times. We can learn a lot from my grandfather's life. Even though he experienced the scourge of war and poverty and a long period of loneliness in his early life, drifting from place to place, he never bowed down to fate nor groaned about anything. He persevered in trying his best to do well and live well each day. Grandfather's hardships since his childhood shaped the way he saw and valued life. Through the difficulties, it developed developed and shaped him to have a good and strong character. He used his bare hands, courage, perseverance, and diligence to create a good future for himself and for his family. Because he didn't have much schooling, he especially valued education and kept the faith that education could improve one's life. So he supported his 5 children with quality education, all becoming professionals in their fields. Because he was an orphan and homeless, he treasured love and family. All of his good quality characteristics, the things he believed and treasured, have influenced his children and are being passed down from generation to generation, to my mum and now to me as well. In the 20th century, my grandfather was a penniless orphan with no one to love him. Now he has a big family and many grandchildren. We all love him so much. At the end, he had a really fruitful and happy life in the 21st century. He is my role model. All my memories with him and my knowledge of him will stay in my heart forever.